So I am here to introduce Dr. Shropp. And just a little bit about her. Dr. Shropp's favorite quote is, "What is mentionable is manageable." It's adopted from Mr. Rogers. She graduated from Howard University with honors with a bachelor's degree in psychology and a master's degree in developmental psychology. Dr. Shropp has written work on creating multicultural curriculum and co-authored psychological articles on counseling in multiculturally salient ways with college students. She has been a therapist for over 15 years and has previously spoken at VLGS on topics including implicit bias, self-compassion, anxiety, and forgiveness. Please help me give a warm welcome to Dr. Sonya Shropshire-Friel.
There we go. All right. So I want to give you some thoughts on brains. Our brain is the factory of emotions. We can actually, that's where the emotions are created. Dalai Lama says, anger may bring extra energy, but it eclipses the best part of the brain, its rationality. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go along. And the energy of anger is almost always unreliable. A little bit about conflict. It persists due to the social circumstances that wire the brains of individuals who participate. So someone must take responsibility to change these circumstances and concepts. We often think about conflict at times on a macro level, but along with that, I also want to talk a little bit more on the micro level. So in my clinical work, I'm a big fan of Winnie the Pooh. There is a Tao of Pooh that I subscribe to. One of the quotes related to that is a conversation between Winnie the Pooh and Piglet. So Pooh muses, "Rabbit's clever." "Yes," said Piglet, "Rabbit's clever. And he has brain." "Yes," said Piglet, "he has brain." There was a long silence. "I suppose," said Pooh, "that's why he never understands anything." So I think framing this in terms of the etymology of conflict, what it means, where it comes from the 15th century early, it comes from the Latin word conflictus, which means essentially to strike together. It is also a discord, action, feeling, or effect, clashing from opposed principles. So I want to talk a little about the stress response and where that comes from. Stress and conflict go hand in hand. When we are in conflict, when there are two opposing ideas or stances or perspectives, we can begin to feel stress, right? It can be a perceived threat. And so our brain, contrary to popular opinion, was not originally evolutionarily designed to help us think. That it does, but actually what it does, according to some neuroscientists, is it helps the body survive, right? And so when we think about survival, we think about fight, flight, freeze, and now there's, the fawn, where you are able to play dead and survive, and your body can survive another day. So what's related to all of that? Well, it starts in the limbic system. So the amygdala, if you look directly at my eyes, right behind them, in the middle, there are two kind of almond-shaped, They're called structures called amygdalae, and they're actually we call them amygdala. And what they do is they help take in, as the information gets taken in from our eyes, our senses, it then activates and triggers an alarm, regulating emotion, particularly fear and aggression, right? And so the hippocampus takes some of that, takes that information and then encodes it and helps it then transition potentially to more permanent memories. So I want to read you a little bit about the stress response. Okay. And I'll refer to this limbic system here as we go along because it figures prominently in terms of helping secrete chemicals that can help us with stress turning into fight, flight, freeze. Okay. So it begins in the brain. When someone confronts an oncoming car or other danger, the eyes and ears send the information to the amygdala. The amygdala interprets images and sounds. When it perceives danger, it instantly sends a distress signal to the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is pretty powerful, okay? It's very much like a command center. This area of the brain communicates with the rest of the body through the autonomic nervous system, which controls involuntary body functions, including breathing, blood pressure, heartbeat, and the dilation or constriction of blood vessels. The autonomic nervous system has two components, the parasympathetic and the sympathetic. Let's start with the sympathetic. So the sympathetic nervous system functions like, if you think about it as a pedal, as the gas. It turns everything on. It provides the body with a burst of energy so that it can respond to perceived dangers. The parasympathetic nervous system acts like a brake, right? It promotes the rest and digest response that calms the body after the danger has passed. So after the amygdala sends that signal, you start getting the glands pumping. It's the epinephrine, which is also known as adrenaline, right? It goes into the bloodstream. It helps the heart beat faster. It helps you, it opens up the small airways in your lungs start to open up wider. Sight, hearing, other senses become sharper. Meanwhile, epinephrine triggers the release of blood sugar, glucose. So this releases then the temporary fat stores at storage sites in the body. The nutrients flood into the bloodstream, and you have all the energy you need to get out of the way of the moving car. And we'll talk a little bit later about when you're in the heat of conversational battle. So after the initial epinephrine subsides, the hypothalamus then activates the second component of the stress response symptoms, and that's known as the HPA axis. So there's the hypothalamus, the pituitary gland, and the adrenal glands, right? The axis relies on hormonal signals to keep the sympathetic nervous system pressed on the gas as long as it's needed. If the brain continues to perceive something dangerous, it adds a little bit more hormone, which gets released in the form of cortisol. So the cortisol helps the body stay revved up when you need that extra energy. When the threat passes, the cortisol levels fall. Now, the parasympathetic nervous system, the brake, then dampens that fight or flight response. So it is a process designed to keep you safe. So it can be an oncoming car, it can be even a difficult conversation that you might be dreading. Anyone have conversations that they are not looking forward to having? Okay, all right. Can you feel at times the sense of dread or maybe a little flip of the heartbeat? Okay, so this is the great thing and also the challenging thing about the brain. It does not distinguish between perceived threats and actual threats, like life and death threats. So there's that fight, flight, or freeze response. It is comprised of thousands of cell circuits. The amygdala, people think about it as a hijacker, like when you're in the heat of battle or you're perceiving a threat, that it overrides the prefrontal cortex, which is the area that's based, that helps reason and executive functioning occur. But that's not necessarily what some neuroscientists believe. A neuroscientist named Feldman talked about body budgeting, and that there is a certain amount of requirements that we need to get through the day. So the brain anticipates what we need before we actually need it. And so there's a certain amount of budgeting. So it's sleep, food, love, the bonding. And when that body budgeting either has not enough or in excess, it takes some time for the brain to make the adjustment. So one of the theories is not that people with mental health challenges like anxiety or depression, it's not necessarily that there's something wrong with their brain. It's that the brain has been trying to anticipate what the body of that person needs before they actually need it. And that can really be dependent on environments. And so it may be that, for example, the war veteran that comes home, having those eyes and ears and that cortisol and the epinephrine coursing through the body is exactly what they needed to keep themselves physically safe and alive. Now, when you get back to perhaps Vermont Law School, there isn't that kind of preeminent physical threat, but it takes time for the brain to actually make the adjustment. And we'll talk a little bit more about neuroplasticity and how that can happen, right? Any questions? Okay. Okay, so this is the other part that I explained about, the sympathetic nerve, I call it sympathizes with the body's plight and does what it needs to do to get you out of harm's way. Okay, so here's the movie clip. We're gonna move into communicating.
Now, I'm sitting here next to you, and if you're going back inside, I'm following you inside, and if you're going home, I'm following you there too. Now, if I've done something to you, just tell me what I've done to you. And if I've said something to you, maybe I said something when I was drunk and I've forgotten it, but I don't think I said something when I was drunk and I've forgotten it. But if I did, then tell me what it was, and I'll say sorry for that too, Colin. With all my heart, I'll say sorry. Just stop running away from me like some fool of a moody schoolchild.
But you didn't say anything to me. And you didn't do anything to me.
Well, that's what I was thinking, like.
I just don't like you no more.
You do like me.
I don't.
You liked me yesterday.
Oh, did I? Yeah.
I thought you did.
So it starts with, thank you so much, like and dislike, and non-communicative processes involved in pitting two people against each other with some dire consequences. Oops. Okay, so the part that I wanted to talk with you about that lets you know there's hope, that we are not just beholden completely, to our brains without change. First of all, we have, I think the ratio is 80 to 128 billion neurons in our brains that are constantly moving and changing. The brain doesn't stop even when we sleep. And so we start the change process slower than babies because they are involved in not only the tuning and pruning, right, parts of the brain where you begin to tune into motor skills, you start being able to assimilate and accommodate information, and there's also mirror neurons that, if you've ever watched a child play peekaboo, right, or you play peekaboo with them, well, there's a certain age at which they're not able to do it. The mirror neurons haven't matured enough yet, but when they reach that age, they're able to mimic. And it is actually the same way with adults. It just takes us a little longer. So, how many think that, it doesn't have to be a show of hands, you can just nod from here, that they can benefit from learning to or having a conversation that's better based on the exchange of ideas and understanding and appreciating as opposed to winning? Okay. Now I realize I'm talking to students in a law school, graduate programs that are affiliated with the law. I realize that winning is at a premium, right? But as we talk a little bit more, I'll fill you in on what can actually be a far more powerful way and genuine way of knowing where you are and then being able to hear the other person. So there are actually 12 steps to the communication, right, process, and it's called compassionate communication. So the first 6 you can do to prepare, okay? So we're going to do a little bit of preparation because if you've ever seen me speak before, we start here. We start here, and then we're able to move out to the space between, right? Okay, so first is relaxation. We'll go through this a little bit more in the next slides. Being present. How many of you remember, or if you've been here before, we talked about mindfulness and being able to listen to your inner self, right? It's cultivating that inner silence, what I call inner listening. Now this sets the stage for more fruitful communication, where understanding might just be possible. So there's increased positivity because there's actually something you can do about that. Values reflection. So if I were to ask you right now, within yourself, do you know what your values are intrinsically? What do you value? What is important to you? And if there's a broad enough space with that you might be looking for a few more answers around it, I can point you in the right direction. And then you retrieve a pleasant memory. All of this happens before you start talking. And I know that's hard, right? Because, we know the phrase coming in hot, right? And you start heading toward you and you're like, uh-oh, sometimes so-and-so's coming to my office or they're stopping by my, coming in hot. So coming in hot doesn't take any of this into account. Okay, so for those of you who have heard me speak about mindfulness before, you know that it is, or if you haven't, I'll tell you, it's intentionally paying attention to what is happening in the present moment that you're in without judgment. That's the hard part, the without judgment. This sucks. It's never going to get any better. This is bad. Those are judgments, and words matter. Talking to people in the law profession, words matter. So once you pay attention to the moment, you pay attention to the next one, and then the next one, and then the next one. Now, the important part is the without judgment, because observing what's happening for you, labeling it, I'm feeling, I'm noticing, is a way of stepping back from your experience. And really, the secret is, what all of these 6, the early 6 are designed to do, is to get you to pause, is to just get you to not come in so hot, even within yourself, right? Because how many people, after they've argued, don't really remember what set it off, right? Because then it becomes about winning, right? So being mindful works. About 40 US law schools currently offer mindfulness instruction, many in for credit courses. Law firms, legal departments, and bar associations also support mindfulness programs. And so there really is something to that pause and that reflection. And if you're curious, John Kabat-Zinn has a masterclass program that is mindfulness-based stress reduction. Question?
When you say mindfulness programs, do you mean like it's embedded in their academic, or is it like an organization?
For them, it's in their program. I put it in their program. Now, every program starts somewhere, right? I remember doing a program called Let's Talk when I was at Cornell. And Let's Talk had this program where students would just show up, didn't have to give their names. They would talk for about 15 minutes about what was going on for them, if they had a current stressor, and then they would, either make arrangements to visit the counseling center if they felt comfortable enough, or maybe they might come and talk that next week. So I say all that to say that every program that ends up becoming implemented usually starts somewhere in the periphery and then begins to enter its way in. So it's still something helpful to do on the way to having that be something that's a part of your curriculum whenever, if ever, that happens. So here's the last 6 of the compassionate communication. Observe nonverbal cues, share appreciation for the other person. I know that when you're in an argument, that's kind of hard, right? Speak warmly, speak slowly, and speak briefly. I know. Then you listen deeply. And we can talk a little bit more about that. So the first part, I always want to give you a little bit of something to go with some of these components. So how many have heard of square breathing? 1, 2, we've got a few? Okay. So when you need a quick break, You breathe in a square. So it is breathing in, exhaling, breathing in, exhaling. You're working your way just around the square. So if it feels hard to pay attention to your breathing and breathe deeply, that's okay. Let's try it now. All right, so I'll start. Breathe in. Pause. Breathe out, pursed lips. We'll do it again. Breathe in. Hold. Breathe out. Even just doing that before a conversation starts can help with a reset. There are also stretching exercises that can serve as a relaxation. I will make sure that I send this information along to Lisa so she can, and Nancy, so they can talk a little bit more, give you the link, because as open as I am to this experience, y'all don't want to see me stretch right now. So, next, being present. So, here's one of the other keys to grounding. When you need to step outside of yourself for a minute and your thoughts, a grounding exercise is called the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. You name 5 things you see, 4 that you hear, and sometimes even silence is something you can hear, right? 3 things you touch, perhaps your hand's on the tablecloth or it's folded over on your hand and you can feel your fingers, perhaps they're cool up against your wrist. Maybe you can feel something in your clothing if your hands are at your side or if your hands are here. Whatever it is, 3 things that you touch, then 2 that you smell. And if you really focus on it, you can smell at least 1 thing. But the searching and the kind of looking for the other is what buys you and your brain time to be less in stress mode. And then 1 that you taste. And that can be one of the examples that we can often give is, what did you have for lunch? What did you have for breakfast? Did you have, juice? Can you still feel the remnants of that on your tongue? If so, that's 1 thing you taste. Another thing that is being involved in being present is the 90 seconds rule. Has anyone heard of the 90 seconds rule? Okay, so Dr. Jill Taylor wrote a book called Stroke of Insight. She is still a neuroscientist, and she had a major stroke that robbed her of speech, of motor ability. She was lucky to survive. What she did as she was recovering, ever in some collective, perhaps unconscious that was still present, began to chronicle her recovery. And one of the things that she noticed was that within 90 seconds, when we experience an intense emotion, the brain, like we talked about, releases the chemicals, courses through your veins and your body. For approximately 90 seconds, you are awash in emotional experience. And then it dissipates. How it comes back is when we look and remember what it was that made us angry or that made us sad or that really conjured up that emotion in the first place. So we can re-trigger that 90-second experience. But one time, if you feel like you have a moment where you're in a really stressful space and you can feel things coursing through your veins, give yourself 90 seconds. Sit. Don't do a thing. Be still, be present, see what happens. You might be surprised. So also listening to your inner self, again, all this happening before you start talking about something with someone else that's difficult. So you name the emotions without judgment. I'm experiencing anger. I can feel hurt. I feel afraid, right? Now, because we are had been in academia, and you all are in academia now, you may think, well, of course I can label my emotions. I will tell you that one of the first things I end up doing with people when they come to visit me for therapy is actually helping them to identify their emotional experience. I've even got a big chart up on the wall that just is a wheel that just names a whole bunch of emotions. And I'm like, pick one. They're like, well, I don't know. I said, well, let's sort of throw the dart and see where we end up. And so it sounds easy, but it actually can be pretty challenging. So sitting still with the breath, 90 seconds, passively watch thoughts and feelings without acting on them, and then return to the breath. So you may envision your thoughts as you're being still as clouds moving by, and they're taking those thoughts with them. And then you gently redirect yourself back to what is called your home base. It's either your breath, it can be holding your fingers where you can feel kind of, the rough, if you really focus, the rough imprints of your fingerprints against the other fingerprint. That's your home base. So bring your focus back to something that is with you, that is internal or external, meaning your body, but that you can reflect back to when you need to be still. Okay, so Dr. Fredrickson, has an interesting rule that's called the 3-to-1 ratio. And she says that we have a tendency, without knowing, to have negative thoughts that outnumber the positive thoughts we might have in a given day, right, or a given moment. So she calls it, you're aiming for like 3-to-1, where you can have 3 positive thoughts and 1 that creeps up that's negative. Okay. Usually it's the other way around, where we're asking, okay, what was something positive that happened? What was something that was good that happened? We search to find the 1, but we don't usually have a difficulty naming the 3. Matter of fact, we could probably keep on going. 5, 10, and then when you're right down to it, the whole day was awful, and you're kind of like, did someone hold the door open for you? Did someone smile? I mean, we can get granular, right? And so there's a website that can help you with this, right? To help you get your quotient of just how many positive thoughts are you experiencing in a day upon reflection, and how many negative. And it's positivityratio.com, where you can check in with yourself every day and see how many positive thoughts come up for you, and what kinds of negative ones creep in there. So values, right? Each one of us has something that is important to us, some concept, some way of being that's important to us. It might be family, it might be kindness, something that reminds you of you, either what you aspire to value or what you value right now. And Brene Brown does a great job about trying to help us determine what we value and it seems easy, but it can feel difficult when we start thinking about what is my value, and how does it interact or play with someone else's value, right? Because when you're sitting across from someone, right, you don't know what the other person's experience is, but this is the point of that kind of exercise, right? We value things. If you start getting curious about what someone else values when you're talking with them, sometimes it makes it a little bit more challenging to be angry, right? And sometimes the things they value are things that we wouldn't value ourselves. But even then, you can be grateful that that person has some, right? So there's also from a pen out of UPenn, Values in Action questionnaire. It's a kind of a character strengths, what your values and how you practice them, things that are important. And so if you just go on to UPenn, and it's the positive psychology program, you can check out the Values in Action. And what it will do is it will give you, once the questions are finished and tabulated, it'll give you an idea of what values you like to practice, right? And how you can continue to foster that. So, hint, this is about self-knowledge, right? Knowing yourself and having an idea of who you are, what makes you tick a little, can help with those difficult conversations. Retrieve a pleasant memory. I went with him because he seems pretty happy, or she seems pretty happy. It could be anything, right? It could be something funny from, a movie that you've seen. It could be a smile that you exchanged with someone else. What I recommend is before you say one word, if you're in a meeting or you're talking with someone about something you know that the other person disagrees with you on, retrieve that pleasant memory. It makes it harder to come in hot. Observe nonverbal cues, right? This is something babies begin to learn as they grow. If their mother or father is grimacing at them, or their caregiver's grimacing at them, if they're smiling, right? We pick up on those cues. I also want to say that this can be culturally salient. So if it seems like, oh, they're not looking at me when I'm talking to them, they may not value me, right? It may not be that at all. It may be that their culture of origin or their culture that they practice doesn't gaze directly at one person's eyes. So when they're speaking, so taking not just this as one example, but putting it into the entire kind of mosaic of taking in information about someone else. That's where those mirror neurons can come in. And I'll talk with you a little bit more about that. They're in the somatosensory, they have been spotted or identified in the somatosensory cortex. And so sometimes you can, if someone smiles at you, you find yourself smiling back, right? If someone, hold on. If someone yawns, you might find yourself yawning as a result. And those are mirror neurons, right? So we need each other's brains to survive, right? The studies all talk about, what can, with other things are held constant, can help prolong life or add to the quality of life. And it's being around other brains. Did you know that when musicians practice, their brain waves sync? So a jam is really more than a jam. It's brains talking to other brains, which is really exciting if you think about it. I mean, your brains, that table right there, something's talking right now. You all being in that space, it's happening, right? Whether you recognize it consciously or not, our brains are designed to need each other, because we've seen with previous studies, both with rhesus monkeys and also with babies, who were involved in war conflict and were kept physically safe, but didn't have other brains to interact with them. That's difficult. They're needing to make up those mirror neurons, right? And so even if we're just grateful that our brain, while I'm standing here, can talk to Lisa's brain, and Nancy's brain, and can talk to your brain, as we're sitting here, it's happening. Share appreciation. Now, sometimes when the other, previous components haven't worked really well, it can feel hard to talk about what you appreciate with someone else. But I tell you, it can happen, and we'll talk about the sandwich method in a minute, but there is a documentary that's called Accidental Courtesy. And it is about an individual who's a musician, who played with jazz greats, one night was sitting at a bar in the South, and someone came up next to him, and they struck up a conversation. What neither one of them knew, right, was that one was in the band, and the other was a member of the Ku Klux Klan. Did I mention the artist was black? So, over a period of time, they began to talk, they began to dialogue, they began to share. What ended up happening was the conversations continued to the point that that individual renounced their membership to the Klan. When the documentary, I think at the time it concluded, he had, just by sitting at the bar and talking to people and sharing his story and having them share his, they got to know more about each other and sharing appreciation. To this point now, 25 individuals have renounced their membership to the Klan. And anytime one person is changed, that means even more for the world, right? Okay. So, talk about what you value about the other person, even if it's, thank you so much for taking the time to meet with me today. I know you had a lot on your plate. I know that you're probably fitting me in. We don't see eye to eye on what we're talking about. I don't think you listen to me when you talk, and when I talk, and I don't think you, et cetera, et cetera. But thank you for meeting with me. That's appreciation. And when it comes to giving difficult kind of feedback or having difficult conversations, utilize the sandwich method. You start out with a compliment. It can't, I guess it could be anything, but it can't be, I'm so glad that you finally agreed I was great to meet with. That would be a passive-aggressive compliment, which is really not a compliment at all. Something that you genuinely appreciate about the other person, even if it's like, I really like that hat, which I do. Now, then after that, you go for the crux of the issue from your perspective, right? You then open it up to, this is what I wanted to talk to you about. This is the struggle I'm having, or it hurt me when you, et cetera, et cetera. You speak from your perspective, right? And the other person, again, brains talking to brains, when you're both still, you have a better chance of communicating on a different level. And then at the end, you end with the nice bread of complimenting them again, which is, thanks for making, again, thanks for making space. Something that came out of the talk that felt somewhat positive, sandwich it. It makes the difficult feedback even more doable. So speak warmly. When I was trying to frame this, I was thinking, how can I convey, what it is to speak warmly to someone else, right? My next, the person in the office, in the business next to my office, she is a trainer, kind of a manager, and she oversees a home nursing care program. When she brings new people on, one of the things she asks them to do is, and they're talking to someone on the phone, is to smile as they're talking. You can hear a smile, right? And so it's a very different experience than, hi. It's very good to talk with you today. What was the problem you said you were having? You can, I'm not smiling. If I am, it's sort of like curved downward. I'm still happy to be here, but I was trying to come up with a way that sounded like I was not speaking warmly. And again, hold a pleasant memory before you speak. Even, Mona Lisa's smile, it's intriguing because it is warm, also slightly aloof, but gets you curious, right? What's happening there? What's going on, right? But depending upon the perspective, there's something that has you moving toward the painting or the print as opposed to, ugh, right? There's something warm, even if it's just this much. Those mirror neurons. Here's a tip. If you speak slowly in the room with another person or other people, when it is their time to speak, they too will speak slowly. There is an interplay that happens. Have you ever noticed that when one person's voice elevates, what usually happens out of instinct is the other person's voice elevates? And in my training for diffusing potentially dangerous situations, the more someone elevated, the softer I got, the slower I talked. You're holding space with the pause. And as a result, because brains talk to other brains, there will be an opportunity for that person to slow down as well, even if you're not, again, agreeing. Okay. So, our conscious minds, this is about speaking briefly, our conscious minds can hold 5 to 9 nuggets of information in a roughly 30-second period. In some ways, we're revisiting our inner child, where they're like, my attention span is 5 seconds, if you're lucky. One of the running stats is that adults' attention span is 8 seconds long. So there's a wide variety in there of how much we're actually listening. And if we're preoccupied, or we're stuck somewhere, or we're in our feelings, that 5 to 9 is maybe 1. Oh, hi, I didn't see you standing there. That's the 1. After that, you're just somewhere else. Essentially, it's enough time to remember a phone number and then utilize it. Now, I realize that what I'm saying is a little difficult because with our cell phones, we don't have to put in numbers, right? For the times we go up and they say, well, what's the number you want to be contacted on, or what's your emergency contact? And you're giving them the number, and then you're like, 60, 3. Hold on, let me get my phone, right? Because we don't have to rehearse that anymore. But in speaking briefly, prune down to the basics of what you want to say. Roughly 30 seconds. Now, the challenge here is that you then need to think about how to distill what you want to say in a way that someone can remember. Anybody watch Ted Lasso? Okay. So you know about Ted Lasso, of course, who speaks quite a bit, but he does it in rhyme. So there's kind of a way to like follow that. It keeps your attention. But there are 2 people that don't speak much at all, Coach Beard and Roy Kent. Now, interestingly enough, they are both short talkers. And so as a result, when one word gets spoken, it's like, oh my gosh. First of all, he talks. Second of all, it's a sentence that's like maybe 2 or 3 words long. Maybe it's even an utterance, but it's brief. And it catches people's attention, right? And so speaking briefly and distilling it down is very helpful. Speak deeply. Listen not only to the words someone is saying, but the tones, the gestures. It's sort of like allow for your body to be a sponge, just like kids and children are often sponges. Be mindful of your need to steer the person toward what you think is the most important thing in the conversation. Because that's less learning and less appreciating and less dialoguing, and it's more about coercion, right? And I imagine that needs to go into the courtroom, but not necessarily when you're talking with someone else and trying to exchange ideas. So, if it is mentionable, it's manageable. Try to see it my way. Do I have to keep on talking till I can't go on? Why to see it your way? The risk of knowing that our love may soon be gone. We can work it out. We can work it out. Life is very short, and there's no time for fussing and fighting, my friends. I have always thought that it's a crime, so I will ask you once again. Thank you. Thank you for making space. Thank you.
Anybody have any questions?
Yeah. I can also do show tunes. Oh, please.
Oh, I think you. Oh, sorry. That's okay. No, I don't.
We had a panel last night in which we were talking about some of the mental health aspects of, or repercussions, I guess, from the pandemic. And since we were talking about brains needing brains and the mirror neurons, I was wondering if you'd be willing to speculate about what you believe that, if that was a contributive factor, and whether or not we're getting that whenever we Zoom, or if we're getting less of what we need in terms of brains speaking to brains when we're like teleconferencing with people.
Yes, yes. That's a great question. In a word, yes, it absolutely impacted our ability to relate and feel like we are being held in the presence of other people, even if we're not talking. I mean, let's think about it. During the pandemic, and one thing that just crossed my mind, a couple of things. If you like music, there was nowhere to go to see it. Brains communicate, right? It's not just the brain waves of the musicians, but it's the brain waves of the people who are sitting enjoying the music, being moved by something, being able to look at a friend and go, oh my God, did you hear that, right? Well, there was no one to really do that with, unless you did it outside. I mean, we had to get creative. The other thing is that Zoom meetings, they're helpful. They were helpful. It was another way to see people, but that energy field, right? The heart beats, it's electrical impulses, and it influences other people, right? Beating hearts. We are surrounded by electricity, right? And when we were by ourselves, or we couldn't be with the people who we most wanted to be with, or even at that point, when things got really kind of difficult, maybe even people we didn't particularly care for, we missed and wanted around, right? And so for people who experience anxiety or depression, not being able to be surrounded by anyone else really impacts the brains. The mirror neurons, they suffer, right? And so one of the things we noticed is that, and again, I'm not, of course, an epidemiologist, I'm a PhD, not an MD, but, there are many more illnesses now, right? Because our bodies have really felt, at times, the loneliness, right? And being disconnected. And if you're someone who experiences depression and you're already struggling with feeling connected and worthy of being in other people's spaces, not having that was really difficult. So now, can we rebound from it? Absolutely. We absolutely can. But we also have to know that's where we're at, right? And there's some repair that needs to be done. Sort of like when we sleep, right? And at different areas of sleep, particularly deep sleep, the cells that are injured, efforts in the body with the fighter cells help repair, right? That's kind of what we're in now, the repair. Okay? Yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
What do you see as the role of the legal field in facilitating effective communication in our communities and our society?
Yeah. So I want to allow for maybe a bit of a speaker's privilege here and say that the world needs lawyers so much now. Our world needs lawyers. And social justice is part of that. It can be embedded in it. What I would say is that the more you know yourself and your values and your strengths, as well as your implicit biases, right? Where and that's one of the things that can happen as a result of being still, right? Those practices help set you up for then being in the legal profession and being able to listen in ways that people aren't listening right now, or that people aren't being listened to. And so mindfulness, the ability to appreciate what the other person's experience is, even if you don't agree. You may come away with with a client or in a legal office and a meeting and saying, I don't agree with most of what they said, but I can appreciate how important that is to them. Just that nuance can make a difference. And so anytime you start with your home base and then you move outward, you're going to be a force. You're going to be a force. And so we need forces right now. I don't know if that answered your question. Okay. Anyone else? Thank you. Hi.
Hi. Okay, great. Thank you so much for everything. And I'm sorry I stepped out, so I don't know if this question or something in the same vein was already asked, but just a question of curiosity. So you talked about being present and holding space for recognizing your feelings. It could be a me thing, or it could be like people who are in academia, but very much like intellectualizing your own feelings. What would you say is like that balance to strike between knowing why you're feeling something and like respecting that feeling, but being able to like proceed forward without really letting it become like your sole focus, letting it take over you?
Okay. So, so I'm hearing intellectualization that may have you less able to kind of be present in the space, and then maybe to interact with someone holding that kind of being able to talk about emotions, label emotions, feel it. Is that the general? I may have missed something.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I guess it's a complex question I'm asking.
That's okay.
Yeah, I guess just being more like recognizing your feeling when you're awash with that feeling. We're talking about like the 90-second period when that feeling comes over you. My brain sort of goes into the drive of like, I'm feeling upset because it was because of this, because I know that this happened and it came from this and this and this. And it's like, I didn't even let myself feel anything, but now I feel like I basically solved it for myself. And so I don't have like, I just didn't feel it, but it sort of makes you feel worse because you never just really, and then it just feels like you go through the whole day sort of just being like, that was a weird thing that just happened. And that's become sort of a pattern. And I don't know if it's really something productive to keep doing to myself. It doesn't really feel like it, but anyways. Not to get into all of that.
Yeah, no, actually, that is a great question. It's like, how does the wheel that keeps spinning, how can you pause that? In a sense, how can you engage your parasympathetic nervous system to kind of slow for a moment and let your feelings catch up, right? Or at least make space for them, right? Because at the end of the day, I'm feeling kind of emotionally crappy, and I don't know why, I kind of do know why, I didn't have time to process. I do think that that's where the pause can be so helpful. Even if you're not recognizing, like after something happens and your body is letting you know something's wonky, something feels a little weird, maybe you feel dismissed, or maybe it didn't, conversation didn't go as well, or maybe, things were just so rushed you didn't have time, right, to kind of feel what was going on. I really encourage people several times a day to set their timer for 1 minute and to sit for 60 seconds. Now, it's not 90, but sometimes we have a premium on time, so we'll shave off the 30 seconds. But to get into practice of sitting, breathing, and just being, and then let whatever comes up come up, right? And it may not be that minute allows you to process through it, but after that you can say, okay, that was this. I was feeling this. And then this happened and I was feeling this. And this is going to take a little bit of time to untangle. But if you take those periodic pit stops during the day and then go home, if you can, right? If there's space, I know you all write a lot, right? But I often wonder how often you write about yourselves and your own experiences. That's really important, right? Because that's where you get the aha. And sometimes it's not a big aha. Sometimes it's like, oh, okay, right? But the interesting thing about what they call mindful journaling, right? That kind of throws in some spices of gratitude if you want to, but that kind of experience will give you a better sense of what was happening for you throughout the day. And you can then go back, in like a week and say, okay, I see it. Because our brains do not process time in the way that we have constructed time, which is why when we grieve, you know, I'll have someone who comes into my office and says, but this happened 6 months ago. Why? I don't understand why I'm not over it now. I'm like, because the brain doesn't recognize time. Not only that, you may be going back into a space where, you know, phantom limb, right? Where it's gone, but it's not really gone. Well, you might be seeing reminders, right? And so it's still present. So the brain doesn't recognize that kind of linear progression of time, 60 seconds, 60 seconds, 60 seconds. And so you need to give it that space. And so what seems like a long time in a day actually really isn't a very long time at all. And you know, for people who do hypnotherapy, time progression is an intervention, right? Because while our conscious mind says it's, you know, 5 o'clock, it's 5:02, it's 5:10, our unconscious mind is saying, we got all the time in the world. I've been here for a while. So does that help a little bit more?
Yes? Yes. Thank you so much.
Oh, no,
I appreciate
you're
it.
so welcome. It's a great question. It's a great question. I really thank you for that. I thank you for all the questions. Yes, please.
Where is it? Oh, there. Thank you.
I'm so excited.
Thank you so much. You mentioned that law programs have some of these tools built into their curriculums, and I'm wondering if you can provide those resources or something similar to some of the folks here. I don't know if they are, you know, just like programs like this week, which was put on mostly by a student group or the mental health committee at school. But I'm not sure if those resources or something similar can be provided to our admin or our deans in terms of how they can embed some of these tools in their teachings, or how we can highlight the importance of this for our law and graduate students.
Sure. Nope, that's also a really great question. UC, I can send along information. UC Berkeley has this embedded, these kinds of strategies, mindfulness-based stress reduction, mindfulness exercises. I can pass that information along. But what I would also say is there is a lawyer, an attorney, her name is Rhonda McGee, and she took the law around social justice and the isms that we often face and can face, and put it together in a book. I'm not remembering the title now, but her name is Rhonda McGee, and she also has some really helpful information about how to open the space for law students in busy lives, right? And kind of our own stuff. I will say that being someone who has been in 2 programs that were, and I'm not taking credit for it because it wasn't me that started it, trailblazer programs at Cornell, like Let's Talk. CCI was Community Consultation and Intervention. What that really ended up being was that me and another colleague, another psychologist, we would go out on campus and find students when they weren't coming to class. You know, when we had gotten a report of someone feeling suicidal, or, you know, there was something that was off. But I will say that it was a grassroots and a needs assessment kind of process that happened. And so it became something that was employed and utilized in other universities. But it started out as like, let's try this and see what we get. And so I guess what I'm saying to that is that it can be that with conflict, right? Someone's and someone else's need to have dialogues, and they need to be with appreciation and also genuine feeling. If there's something that you're feeling would be helpful to have, chances are you might be surprised, right? That there may be like, we could all use some mindfulness right about now. How do we make this work, right? And so there can be those conversations. I'd be happy to pass along information, but I will, even if, like, you all had, start small. Masterclass. Put John Kabat-Zinn up on the projector, right? And then, grab some mats. Sit and try some, mindfulness, just to kind of get started. I think that it will likely, it could, but I don't, in my experience, when something became a program, it started out as let's try this, we're going to make space for this, and then as it gained momentum, there was buy-in. I don't know if that helps. Anyone else? It's time for one more question. Great.
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you so much for coming. Can you talk a little about the impact of marginalized communities and how they receive and how they utilize and mental health? So I'm thinking particularly about low SES communities, about immigrants, about people who don't have access to mental health services, and those of us who want to interact and help and do.
Okay.
Thank you.
Sure. And so, hold on for 1 second. You're wondering how working with marginalized communities, how this could fit in? Nope. I may have missed something.
I guess I was thinking about early in your presentation, you were talking about the brain and how it works, and I'm wondering if being constantly under stress, like lots of law students,
Yes.
But even more than that, being under stress from being unhoused, from being afraid of authorities, of having all kinds of circumstances like that, how that impacts the ability to do all of these things that you've showed us.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes. It absolutely can, and here's why. That stress response, that running HPA axis, the cortisol that keeps getting emitted, the cultural mistrust, understandably, the brains need to preserve the body, right, and help to keep it safe. How can they do those things or employ those things when they are in such a running, constant state, right? Well, that's where other brains come in, because, like, when you get someone in your office or you have a connection with someone who is struggling like that, like, just have them notice their breathing, kind of get them noticing other things that are, of course, not taking away from what's already happening, but it is routinized, it's motorized, it's just try and stay alive or get the needs that you have met, kind of like the body, the brain's body budgeting, right? I think that it is hard, and I think that systemically there's an issue that we're not attending to. We're few issues that we're not attending to. So as a result of there not being more systemic work around the pause and getting people to slow down. Because the thing is, it would be great if law enforcement, if the police can slow down, right? If they slow down, there will still be cultural mistrust. I'm not saying all police, of course, right? I'm just saying, if we look at the news, right, you can tell somebody's foot was on the gas. It was sympathetic nervous system all the way. It was not parasympathetic. And in that way, it is both ground up and trickle down, right? Because it can't just be, it's helpful to meet individually and have people, because and have those kinds of conversations and try and help them, notice the brakes that they can put on. But when they leave their home or they're in a grocery store, somebody else doesn't have their foot idling, doesn't have the pedal idling. And so in that way, I would say there needs to be the systemic first. It needs to, the umbrella needs to be, it doesn't mean that individuals, like we're talking now, right? It's like each one teach one, right? Take away 4 things from today and see how it can fit in your life and pass it on. But there need to be programs that are like this in law enforcement and areas of power, because you can get someone who has who is listening to their inner self and manage to pause and put on their brake, and during the course of a day, someone in authority has their foot on the gas, their sympathetic nervous system engaged, and all of that's, all of that is in jeopardy. And so I guess I'm tweaking your question a little, and the tweak is that there needs to be systemic, intervention. I'll just take, police officers, or maybe people in law enforcement, or social security offices. I need to be having those kinds of conversations with them, right? But since I'm not there, I am working with Vermont Law School, who will also then carry some of that message, right? It's a great question.
Thank you so much, Dr. Schropp.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for the questions. Thank you for sticking around. It's always a joy coming here. Thank you.